So we know the Pac-12 has decided to play football the first weekend of November and should be able to catch up with everyone else to be in consideration for a college football playoff. Besides that, we know a schedule, and then we're guessing from there. That's the reason we bring in people like Alicia De Artola from Reign of Troy to fill in all the blanks for us, even though, Alicia, you don't necessarily know what's going on at this point with USC still to hit the field in preparation for that opener against Arizona State. But we, of course, appreciate you stopping by, because when I think USC, I think you. And let's get you on here to talk Trojans. So they haven't hit the field officially, but they're a few days away from getting set for what's now fall practice, right?
That's the plan, is to start practicing on the 9th. At least that's what we've heard from USC. So if nothing gets in the way of that over the next couple of days, hopefully everyone is able to stay safe, stay free of COVID-19. The testing's all set up and everything's good to go. They should be able to get out on the field for the first time for full team, or as far as full team practices as they can go. They can have 75 players out on the field at a time. So that's a lot more than they were able to do before, when they were limited to 12. So it's a huge step in the right direction for USC, and now it's full speed ahead. They have 4 weeks to get ready for the start of the season, and these are going to be a really, really critical 4 weeks, not just on the football side of things, of preparing for the season, but also having everything go to plan, which, as we know from this whole year, things going to plan isn't always the way things work out. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah, so going into last weekend's action, I had counted 95 games scheduled, 16 canceled, 79 out of 95 played. So that's roughly 80 to 85% of the games. The Pac-12 is going to play, it's a 7-game schedule, correct?
Yeah, 7 games with no breaks in between. So they can't really afford any hiccups here. They do need it to go smoothly. Other conferences have been able to cancel games and reschedule them for later in the season. There's no wiggle room for the Pac-12. So they're pretty confident in their testing, and they are, so far, USC has had, I think it's 4 straight weeks of 0 positive results. They've been keeping their heads down. They've been doing everything right. And so hopefully that all pays off. But, we will see over the next few weeks.
No wiggle room for the Pac-12 or the Big Ten, but I love what both conferences are doing that final weekend, not just the championship game, but seeding the rest of the division teams and lining them up for what's going to be games that we're not going to know how they're going to match up until the conclusion of the previous week. So it makes it a bit interesting on championship weekend, matching up like seeded teams. Got Alicia De Artola on the line from Reign of Troy. Please check out her work. She always delivers for us, talking USC. I'm going to guess, not that it matters now, but if we went back in time 1 month, unless you knew something that the rest of us didn't, you were thinking that there would be no Pac-12 football. Nobody I talked to thought that there was a chance in hell that there was going to be Pac-12 football, and I certainly didn't either.
I thought that they could pull off a January start. I thought we'd see potentially Pac-12 football in 2021 if they wanted it to happen. I thought it was realistic. I thought they could work out all the deals with having 2 seasons in 1 year and all of that. And then they announced the new testing program in early September, and it still felt like, okay, well, this is in the future. In California, they still didn't have the approval to start practicing. It was still very up in the air. So things developed extremely quickly, but the Big Ten moving forward pretty much forced their hand. They couldn't be left behind if they wanted to be still considered a Power 5 conference. And so everyone else is playing. Pac-12 finally got their testing. They were able to square the medical side of things with the financial and competitive side of things. And now here we are. But I certainly wasn't expecting out of nowhere, okay, we're playing games on November 7th. I certainly didn't think that was going to happen until it literally happened.
So, Alicia, when you size up the offense, looking at who's coming back, who's been lost, maybe some top recruits they could factor in to fill some gaps, give us a review on that side of the ball.
Keaton Slovis had an outstanding freshman season, expecting big things from him in year 2. They only lose Michael Pittman. They return Tyler Vaughns, who's one of their leading receivers. They return Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's another NFL caliber receiver that USC is going to send up into the pros probably after this year. They get Brew McCoy, who is the former five-star recruit who wasn't able to play last year because he was redshirting and he was sick. Kyle Ford was injured and might be able to maybe contend to get back in time for the late side of this season. And they're bringing in Gary Bryant Jr. As one of the new recruits who could be a force in the slot for USC. So the air raid should be good to go. They've got a great core of running backs that we'll see how much they use them, but they are completely set on offense, except for the second most important bit of the offense behind the quarterback, which is who's going to protect the quarterback. And right now, it's complete guesswork. The guy who they thought was going to protect Keaton Slovis' blind side is no longer there. So it'll be a process of figuring out how they can shuffle around veteran players to fill in that left tackle spot and the right tackle spot, which also needs replacing. Or are they going to turn to one of the young freshmen or redshirt freshmen that we haven't seen yet? So it's a big, big, big question mark. It's not where USC would want to be on the offensive line, but this is the bed they made for themselves as far as recruiting that position over the last few years. So that is the number one determiner of whether or not USC will be successful this year is can they keep Keaton Slovis upright? And if they can, it'll go really well. And if they can't, it'll be an interesting season.
Yeah, it's the most important unit on the field. If you consider the quarterback being the most important player, individual player, the offensive line's the most important unit. It requires the most intelligence other than the quarterback, requires the most chemistry. Usually the players have to be the most versatile. If you want to be able to put the 5 best players out there and not restrict them to tackle, guard, center, where you can move guys between guard and tackle and guard and center, and it becomes a matching game because it never works out perfectly that you can get the best players in the 5 best slots. So it's and the offensive line coach is certainly a key factor in all that. Alicia, when I think USC defense since the heyday and since the scholarship reductions and all of that depleted the roster, and certainly that can't be an excuse years and years later, but it's been a defense where when I watch USC play 5 to 8 times a year, it's like 3 to 4 guys flash on every defense as just being crazy, ridiculous, tremendous players, but depth along the defensive line, just some issues that start with depth first and foremost that just keep it from being a really good defense.
Yeah, USC has recruited rather well on defense. If you were just to put stock totally in recruiting star rankings, the defense is perfectly fine. They've got 4 and 5 stars all over the place. But last year, it just it didn't work. Clancy Pendergast maybe mailed it in. The scheme changes that they tried to make didn't work. Everything pretty much went wrong by the end of the season on the defense. So this year is all about settling in with Todd Orlando as the new defensive coordinator and seeing what he can get out of these players, which there is talent to work with. USC secondary was extremely young last year and performed admirably well. And there's a thought that the new safeties coach and the new cornerbacks coach, Craig Niver and Dante Williams, will be able to take that group, get them to gel and really get the most out of them, especially when you think, talent. Speaking of players who spark, who stand out on when you watch a game, Talanoa Hufanga, when he's been healthy, has been outstanding. Isaiah Polamau has had his moments. Both of those are safeties. At corner, they have Elijah Griffin, Isaac Taylor Stewart, Chris Steele. These are 5-star athletes. So if they're able to get them all to gel, then that secondary could be quite good, actually. The biggest problem is similar to the offense. They've lost Jay Tufele, who is their best defensive lineman. So another loss in the trenches that they're going to have to deal with. They didn't have exceptional depth on the defensive line to begin with, but they do have some players there like Drake Jackson who could spark at that defensive end spot. They have established starters like Marlon Tuipulotu. So the defensive line is just going to be about reshuffling a little bit to see where they can fill in the gap that Jay Tufele is leaving behind. But the biggest question mark, absolutely the biggest question mark, is at linebacker. USC has the tradition of great linebackers that they've had over the decades, and frankly, the linebacking core has been poor, absolutely poor. They were the worst part of the defense this last season, and they need to be better. Absolutely need to be better, and that's going to be something that I will be watching very, very closely. Can they get more out of players like Paula Iheanacho, who is another 5-star guy, incredibly talented, but just did not fit at all in what USC was trying to do last year. And then maybe get someone like Solomon Tulipupu healthy. And he's another really highly rated guy out of Mater Dei who has just been dealing with injuries this whole time, and we haven't really gotten to see him. Those guys gel, those guys get settled into this new system. I think USC will have a perfectly capable defense that may have some growing pains with Todd Orlando, but they have the pieces there. It's really going to come down to what Todd Orlando does, how he lines it up, how quickly the players are able to grasp a defense, especially when they didn't get a spring camp. They had all of this theoretical knowledge that they've been learning on Zoom for the past 6 months, but now they need to put into practice, and that's what these next 4 weeks will be the proving ground, because they don't have a lot of time to get familiar with this offense, with this defense. But if they can hit the ground running, I like the pieces. I'm very skeptical about the ability of them all to come together in a coherent way where everyone's on the same page and all of that talent is actually getting maximized.
Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the Trojans. We got Alicia De Artola on the line from Reign of Troy, and USC's about a month away from hitting the field against Arizona State. 9 a.m. local time. 9 a.m. They're going to make these boys hit the field, be fully ready to go, and playing a major game in the Pac-12 South. They could decide the division. So when you looked at the schedule when it was re-released, we know that the format is typically 9 conference games. So you play everyone in your division, and you play all but 2 teams in the other division. So you're playing 9 of the other 11 teams in the Pac-12. So other than the Big 12, it's the truest champion for me, because you're playing the most conference games against the least number of opponents. But now we're looking at 7 games. So you play everyone in your division. So you're playing those 5 and then 2 other teams. And then you may play a rematch against somebody depending on the seedings that final weekend, or you could play somebody completely different. So what hits you about the schedule?
That 9 a.m. kickoff against ASU is really the test. It's absolutely the test. It's such a weird start time. I think Urban Meyer on Big Noon Kickoff was talking about how his team under those circumstances would have to have a 4:30 a.m. wake up call. So that is going to be, just contextually, that is going to be fascinating. Outside of the whole, these are 2 contenders in the South, ASU trying to prove that they can take that next step forward with Herm Edwards, and USC trying to prove that they can live up to the talent and hype that's available to them. After that, the schedule works out beautifully for USC. They get Utah on the road, but it's Rice Eccles without a ferocious crowd. It's Utah early on in the season when they are replacing everybody and their mother on their roster. So that's their second toughest game. And it's not an easy game by any stretch. It never is when you have to travel to Utah. USC hasn't traveled to the Mountain West in any sort of style over the last few years, but those are the tough tests. Everything else just flies out right for USC. They get, Arizona shouldn't be a challenge. Colorado's, I don't expect them to be a challenge. UCLA, maybe UCLA becomes a bit of a resurgence under Chip Kelly. We'll see what he's able to do, but a lot of skepticism around them. And then their North matchup is against Washington State, who is without Mike Leach, who is without Aaron Gordon, who is without, I think they've lost 6 wide receivers from their 6 leading wide receivers between graduations and transfers. Nick Rolovich is in his first year in the Pac-12, and what a weird first year this is going to be for him. So it all kind of goes in USC's favor here if they can get through ASU, and then obviously they need to show up against Utah. But there is absolutely no reason on paper, and this is always the problem with USC, but there's no reason on paper that they shouldn't go 6-0 through these games and get themselves into the Pac-12 title game, and then, see where you go from there. But that, as far as fortunate schedules go, USC lost their hardest games from the original schedule. They don't have to play Alabama. They don't have to play Notre Dame. They don't have to play Oregon. They don't have to play Washington. Couldn't have asked for better.
So I think I was off by 1. So 6 scheduled, then there's the
It's
championship weekend.
Yes, it's 6 plus 1. So
Yep.
it'll be 7 total, and it'll be every weekend from November 7th through to the 19th.
And then the selections for the college football playoff, which is much speculation about what the Pac-12 would have to do. The Big 12 is stumbling right now, so that's good for the Pac-12. But you got to think there would have to be an undefeated team emerge from the Pac-12 most likely.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm laughing because I've had debates with my with Michael, my podcast partner, about how the Pac-12 was going to get left out of the playoff, even if they went undefeated, because I didn't imagine that Oklahoma would lose 2 games in their first 3 weeks. So the Big 12 is absolutely begging the Pac-12 to take that playoff spot. But it'll require Oregon or USC or, maybe ASU, maybe Washington, somebody to go through this schedule undefeated. And like I said, on paper, I think USC has a very good shot of that. But as we're seeing with Oklahoma, as we're seeing with Texas, as we're seeing with some of these other schools out there, it's easier said than done when you're coming off of such a crazy offseason, when you have so many factors that you're trying to play in, and when you're playing in mostly empty stadiums, and it's a whole different kind of challenge for teams. The teams that are able to navigate that best are going to make it through, but there is no guarantee that any of the Pac-12 teams are going to be able to make it through unscathed in this season. And that's going to be the biggest problem for the Pac-12, because I don't think there's any chance that a one-loss Pac-12 team gets in.
Yeah, we've got no cross-sectional games between the Power Fives to rate the conferences. So the only fair thing to do, I know there's going to be an eyeball test, and I know there's going to be perception that the SEC is the best and the Pac-12 or the ACC, depending on your point of view. And with Notre Dame in play, probably the Pac-12 being the worst. So that perception is going to come into play, even though I think it should be completely eliminated, that you can only judge these conferences based on the games that they're playing within the conference. And you've got to award records. You got to go by record, and then by dominance within the conference against their competition. And then the only side note to that would be what we've seen out of the Big 12 in playing out-of-conference games against the Group of Five and the Sun Belt in particular, looking like garbage. And then those teams coming into conference and then beating the big boys. So it's an interesting dynamic for them. So that's how I see it, but I don't necessarily think the bias can be eliminated.
No, that I agree. And I think that the Pac-12 has a really bad habit of eating itself alive, which is kind of what the Big 12 is doing right now. It's normally what the Pac-12 is doing. And that's going to be the problem for the Pac-12, is they would be best served if the Arizonas and Colorados and Washington States and Stanford this year, if those teams just laid down and got curb stomped and let the better teams in the conference go and put together stronger records. But that's not the Pac-12 style, so I certainly wouldn't predict that.
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily applies as heavily this year as in a standard year, but I think it's been pretty much proven that in regards to at least perception, the best way to structure your conference, and of course you can't structure it, it just plays out the way it does, is to have an elite team. Have Ohio State, have Alabama, have somebody like that, but then not have a jump off the cliff like the ACC. Have your Wisconsins, your Penn States, or your LSU's, typically Texas A&M, Florida's, a respected second tier that people can look and say, oh, there's a bunch of top 15 teams there that are pushing the elite team. So, and that's what your structure is, and that seems to be the best perception, the best look.
Yeah, and the Pac-12 has made a habit of having, a handful of fringe top 25 teams instead of, those 2 or 3 top 15 teams that you need. So maybe this year will be different. We'll see, but certainly the trend doesn't bode well for the Pac-12. But the one thing we know about this season is predicting anything is just fruitless. So we'll see how it plays out, and we'll see where everything looks like on December 20th, I guess.
She is the Penguin of Troy. So check her out on Twitter. Follow her right there. Just look up Penguin of Troy. You see the reignoftroy.com on the banner right there. So follow her as well right there, covering USC. And as we get closer to the season, it may become a little bit clearer, although, of course, training camp shut down and the access is difficult. But Alicia, we know that you'll be on top of it as much as you possibly can.
Yep, that's the plan, and I'm excited for football to be back in any form, even if I have to, sneak and look through a fence grating to see what the offensive line lineup is. I don't think USC will even let me do that, but we'll see.
Whatever it takes. Thanks, Alicia. Appreciate it.
Thank you.